All right, let's dive into this thing. Crypto taxes in Denmark, am I right? Everyone wants to know, but honestly, it's a bit of a jungle out there.
It really is. A lot to untangle.
Well, we've got our machete today, this massive report from Skatterådet, that's the Danish Tax Council for those just joining us. It's called Finansielle Kryptoaktiver, or Financial Crypto Assets in plain English. And let me tell you, over 75 pages, all in Danish. So buckle up, folks, because we're going to hack through all the jargon and get to the good stuff, what you need to know.
We'll extract the key insights so you can actually understand what's going on and maybe even plan ahead a little.
Exactly. So let's start with the basics. Like, what exactly are we talking about when we say financial crypto assets?
Well, the report defines it as, let me see, tradable digital representations of value or rights.
Right. So digital. Okay.
Transferable and stored electronically using this thing called distributed ledger technology, or DLT, think blockchain. That's the most famous one.
Ah, blockchain. Always gotta have blockchain. But hold on. This definition seems pretty broad, doesn't it?
It is. And I think that's intentional. They're trying to capture all these different types of assets that are popping up. It's not just Bitcoin anymore.
So beyond Bitcoin, what else are we talking about?
Well, you've got stable coins, for example.
Mm-hmm.
They're designed to stay, well, stable by pegging their value to something like the US dollar or gold.
Ah, so it's like a digital version of a traditional asset.
You could say that. And then there's the world of non-fungible tokens, or NFTs.
NFTs. Those are everywhere these days.
They represent ownership of something unique.
Yeah.
Like the piece of digital art, a collectible, or even virtual real estate.
Wild stuff. So basically, this definition is trying to keep up with all the crazy innovation happening in the crypto world, right?
Exactly. It's acknowledging that things are moving fast, and they need to be flexible to accommodate all these new assets.
Makes sense. But why is it so tricky to tax this stuff? I mean, taxes, they're always complicated, but with crypto, it seems like a whole other level.
Yeah, the core issue is that our current Danish tax law just doesn't have a neat little box to put these new assets into.
So where do they end up?
Well, the report actually brings up cases where Bitcoin, for example, has been treated differently for tax purposes. Sometimes they've seen it as speculation, kind of like gambling.
Really? Gambling?
Yep. Sometimes it's been categorized as hobby income, and sometimes even income from a non-business enterprise.
So three completely different categories. Imagine trying to figure out your taxes with all that uncertainty.
Exactly. And the way you categorize something has huge implications. It affects how your gains are taxed, if you can deduct your losses, and ultimately whether the whole system is fair to taxpayers.
That's a good point. Fairness seems like a big deal here.
It is. And the report talks about asymmetric tax treatment, where, say, your gains are taxed at a higher rate and your losses are deductible. That can really hit people who are actively trading.
Ah, so even if your gains and losses balance out over the year, you could still end up paying more in taxes.
Yeah, potentially. It's one of the big issues they're grappling with.
Okay, so Denmark's got some work to do, but are we alone in this struggle? Are other countries facing these same challenges?
Oh, absolutely. It's a global issue. But different countries are trying different approaches, and the report actually has this handy table comparing Denmark to some other countries.
Oh, cool. Let's see what our neighbors are up to. What about Sweden?
They have a system pretty similar to ours, actually. They use capital gains taxation with this broad catch-all category for crypto.
So the Scandinavians are in the same boat?
Pretty much. Now, Norway, they also use capital gains tax. But on top of that, they have a wealth tax.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so Norwegians also have to declare the value of their crypto holdings every year.
Ouch. Sounds like a lot of paperwork.
Definitely adds an extra layer. Then you have Germany. They treat crypto as other economic goods for capital gains purposes.
So similar to Denmark, but with a slightly different name for the category.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And across the pond, the U.S., they also use capital gains taxation. But there's a big but. They require you to report every single crypto transaction.
Wait, really? Every single one?
Buying, selling, even using crypto to buy goods and services.
That's insane. Imagine trying to keep track of all that.
It can get very complicated very quickly. And then there's the UK. They also use capital gains, but they have this system called pooling, where they calculate all your crypto gains and losses together.
Okay, so it's like throwing all your crypto activity into one big pot at the end of the year.
Exactly. So lots of different approaches, but no clear winner, no global consensus on the best way to handle crypto taxes.
It's a bit of a Wild West out there, huh? Especially for folks who are investing or doing business internationally.
Definitely highlights the need for some international cooperation and maybe some harmonization of these rules.
All right, so we've got the lay of the land. What's the problem? Now, I know the report doesn't just stop at pointing out the issues. They actually dive into some potential solutions for Denmark, right?
Yeah, they explore three possible models:
Hmm.
the realization model, the net result model, and the inventory model.
Three models. All right, break it down for us. What's the deal with this realization model?
Well, it's the most familiar one because that's basically what we have now. You only get taxed when you sell the asset and actually realize a gain, no tax bill. Sounds simple, right?
On the surface, yeah, pretty straightforward. But I have a feeling there are some catches, aren't there?
Well, one big challenge is just the sheer volume of transactions happening in the crypto world. If you're actively trading, imagine trying to track every single buy and sell.
Yeah, that sounds like a nightmare. Spreadsheets for days.
It can get overwhelming. And then remember that asymmetric treatment we talked about? Gains taxed higher than losses are deductible? Well, that can really create problems under the realization model.
So even if things even out over the year, you could still end up owing more in taxes.
Exactly. It's one of the big drawbacks they highlight with this model when it comes to the fast-paced world of crypto.
Okay, so realization model not perfect. What about this net result model? It sounded kind of promising because it's about the overall gains or losses for the year, right?
It is, and it could definitely simplify things for taxpayers. But there's a big hurdle. The data Denmark gets from exchanges is aggregated, just yearly totals. And guess what? It arrives after the tax filing deadline.
So it's like having all the pieces of the puzzle but not being able to put them together in time.
Exactly. It creates a logistical nightmare if you want to implement this model fairly and accurately.
Okay, so realization model has issues with all the trading activity and the asymmetric treatment, and net result model has data problems. So that leaves us with the inventory model. What's the scoop there?
Well, this one's interesting. It says, hey, let's tax the change in the value of your crypto holdings each year, regardless of whether you sell or not.
Hold on, so even if I don't sell my crypto and haven't actually made any money, I could still owe taxes.
That's the idea. And it aligns with how some other assets are taxed in Denmark, like stocks and investment companies.
That's a pretty big shift.
Wow.
And wouldn't that mean you could end up owing taxes on gains you haven't actually realized yet? Like, what if the value of my crypto goes through the roof, but I'm holding on to it long term? I might not have the cash to pay those taxes.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. And the report does acknowledge that potential downside. But it also emphasizes that this model could really simplify things, especially for those who are actively trading. No more tracking every single buy and sell.
So it's like a trade-off. Potential tax headaches on one hand, but easier record keeping on the other.
You got it. It's about finding that balance that works for both the taxpayers and the tax authorities.
All right, this is all super insightful, and I'm really keen to hear more about how the report weighs the pros and cons of each of these models.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We're picking up our crypto tax conversation, looking at how Denmark could actually approach this whole thing.
Right.
We left off with those three models: realization, net result, inventory, trying to figure out which one makes the most sense. And it sounded like the inventory model, where you're taxed on the change in value every year, even if you don't sell, had some pros and cons.
Definitely. And the report really gets into the weeds, comparing these models based on a few key principles. Like, how easy is it for regular people to understand? Does it prevent people from dodging taxes? And does it make sure the government gets its fair share, all while keeping up with this crazy, fast-moving crypto world?
Makes sense. Those are some big questions. So let's go back to the realization model for a second. That's taxing you only when you sell, right? Seems simple at first, but I remember you mentioned some issues. What makes this model tricky in practice?
Well, for one thing, think about how many crypto transactions some people make. It's a ton. If you're actively trading, trying to keep track of every single buy and sell.
Ugh, yeah, that sounds like a total headache.
Yeah.
Spreadsheet overload. Exactly. And then remember that whole thing about asymmetric treatment, where gains are taxed higher than losses are deductible. That really becomes a problem with the realization model.
So even if your wins and losses kind of balance out over the year, you could still end up owing more in taxes.
Yep, that's the risk. The report really highlights that as a major drawback, especially with how dynamic the crypto market is.
Okay, realization model maybe not the best fit. What about the net result model, where you're just taxed on your overall gains or losses at the end of the year?
It does sound simpler on the surface, right? But the big problem is the data. Remember, Denmark only gets yearly totals from the exchanges, and that information arrives after the tax deadline.
So even though it might be easier for people to understand, it's a logistical mess for the government.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the inventory model, which tries to address some of those issues. Taxing the change in value every year, whether you sell or not, lines up with how they already tax some other assets, like certain types of stocks.
But that still brings up that whole issue of owing taxes on gains you haven't actually cashed in on. Imagine your crypto value triples, but you're holding on to it long term.
Yeah.
Suddenly you get hit with a huge tax bill.
Right, that's a valid concern, and the report definitely acknowledges that potential downside. It could create some real challenges, especially if the value swings wildly.
Definitely not ideal. But on the flip side, it would make record keeping so much simpler, right? Especially for those active traders.
That's the trade-off they're weighing. Instead of focusing on when you buy and sell, it's about capturing the overall change in value over the year. Which leads to another interesting question. How do you even determine the fair market value of your crypto, especially at the end of the year?
Good point. It's not like traditional stocks where there's one central exchange setting the price. Crypto prices can be all over the place.
Exactly. It's a decentralized market, so they have to come up with a system that's fair and prevents people from manipulating things. The report talks about using prices from major, well-established exchanges as the benchmark.
Okay, so using reputable sources for pricing makes sense. But with all these different exchanges, how do they prevent people from just choosing whichever price benefits them the most?
That's where good regulation and oversight come in. The report stresses the need for clear guidelines on which exchanges to use and how to handle any price differences. They want consistency and transparency.
So it's not just about picking a model, it's about building the whole framework around it to make sure it actually works.
You got it. And speaking of the bigger picture, remember we talked about how each country is kind of doing its own thing with crypto taxes? Well, there might be some light at the end of the tunnel.
Oh, tell me more.
There are a couple of international initiatives gaining traction that could help harmonize things. One's called CRF, the Crypto Asset Reporting Framework developed by the OECD, and the other is DAC8, an amendment to the EU's Directive on Tax Cooperation.
Okay, acronyms galore. But in simple terms, what are these things trying to do?
Basically, they're all about increasing transparency and making countries share information about crypto transactions, setting clear rules on how to report stuff, and exchange data on who owns what.
So instead of everyone working in isolation, there's a push towards collaboration.
Exactly. And that's huge for preventing tax avoidance and making sure everyone's playing by the same rules. Remember how we talked about the U.S. requiring people to report every single crypto transaction?
Yeah, that sounded like a paperwork nightmare.
Well, CRF and DC8 aim to streamline all that by creating a common language for crypto taxation across borders.
Interesting. So if Denmark had access to more detailed information, maybe that net result model wouldn't be such a logistical headache.
That's the key insight. With more timely and granular data, something like the net result model could become much more feasible.
So it's not just about picking the right model, it's about having the right infrastructure and international cooperation in place to make it work.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a multifaceted problem, so we need a multifaceted solution.
All right, the moment of truth. We've laid out all the challenges with taxing crypto, explored the different models. Now, what does the Danish Tax Council actually recommend Denmark do about all this?
Well, they've really looked at it from all angles, weighed the pros and cons of each model, and they've landed on a recommendation. They say Denmark should switch from the current realization model to the inventory model.
So going all in on taxing the change in value every year, even if you haven't sold anything, that's a pretty big move, isn't it?
It is, but they argue that in the long run, this is the model that best balances everything being fair to taxpayers, making sure the system is accurate, and keeping things manageable for both people and the tax authorities.
Makes sense. But I remember they pointed out some potential issues with just relying on yearly data from exchanges. How does that fit in with the inventory model?
You're right. That was a key concern. And this is where those international frameworks we talked about, KRFM and DCA, become really important. The report's actually quite optimistic that these initiatives will lead to much better information sharing between countries. More details, more timely data.
So instead of just getting yearly totals, Denmark could actually get more granular data. That would be huge.
It would. And with that kind of data, The tax authorities could implement the inventory model much more effectively. Make sure everyone's paying their fair share, but without making it overly complicated for people.
Okay, so inventory model it is, but they also go deeper into some specifics, right? Like how to handle those tricky valuation questions we talked about.
Absolutely. For figuring out the fair market value of your crypto at the end of the year, they recommend using prices from those major reputable exchanges.
Okay, so making sure the source is reliable. What about the situations where there's a big price difference between different exchanges? How do they prevent people from just picking the price that benefits them most?
Transparency is key. They emphasize the need for clear guidelines on which exchanges to use as benchmarks and how to handle any price differences. Consistency and fairness across the board.
Makes total sense. They don't want people gaming the system.
Exactly. And they even tackle the issue of lost wallets. If you lose your private keys and can't access your crypto anymore.
Yeah, that's a scary thought for any crypto investor. What do they say about that?
Well, it's tough to prove a loss in those situations. So their proposed solution is to treat those lost assets as if they were sold at their last known value. So no deduction for the loss, but you also wouldn't face further tax liability if those assets somehow reappeared later on.
Interesting approach. Not ideal, but it seems like a practical way to deal with something that's really difficult to prove. But what about people who bought their crypto a while back under the old rules? How would the transition to this new inventory model work?
They thought about that too. They recommend using the original purchase price as the starting point for those assets. No need to recalculate everything based on some random historical value. It's about making the transition as smooth as possible.
That seems like the fairest way to handle it. And
Yeah.
speaking of fairness, there was that key principle they kept bringing up, technology neutrality.
Right. The idea that similar assets should be taxed in a similar way, no matter what technology they're based on. So no special treatment just because it's crypto.
So no need to reinvent the wheel, just adapt the existing system to fit these new digital assets.
Exactly. It's about creating a level playing field and avoiding loopholes that could mess things up for everyone.
Well, there you have it, a deep dive into the Danish Tax Council's recommendations for taxing crypto assets. Definitely complex stuff, but hopefully we've shed some light on the key issues and potential solutions.
It's a constantly evolving landscape, so staying informed is more important than ever. This report is a great place to start for anyone who wants to understand how Denmark's approaching this challenge.
The crypto world moves fast, and tax laws have to keep up. So stay curious, stay engaged, and as always, keep those wallets secure. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.